A man once kept his job at the English royal court for one reason. He could fart on command. Another guy's entire career was warming the king's bed with his naked body, and then quietly leaving. And one emperor promoted, married, and exiled an officer who literally did not exist, because nobody had the guts to tell him it was a typo. These are the servants and advisors that history tried to forget. But we are not going to let that happen. 33 of them, each one weirder than the last. 1. Let's start with arguably the most intimate job in all of royal history. The Groom of the Stool was a real, official position in the English court. And yes, his primary duty was to assist the king during his most private bathroom moments. We are talking wiping the royal backside. But here is where it gets interesting. This was not some low-ranking, humiliating gig. The Groom of the Stool was one of the most powerful men in England because he had unrestricted access to the king during his most vulnerable, unguarded moments. While the king sat on the toilet, he would chat, gossip, share secrets, and discuss state affairs. So the guy handling the royal behind was also handling state secrets. Under Henry VIII, the Groom of the Stool basically became the king's closest confidant and unofficial therapist. Nobles would bribe and scheme for years just to get this job. Let that sink in. Men literally fought for the privilege of wiping a king's butt. 2. In the 12th century, during the reign of King Henry II of England, there was a man named Roland the Farter. His official title, court flatulist. His one contractual obligation was to appear before the king every single Christmas and perform, and I quote, "one jump, one whistle, and one fart." That was the whole job description. One jump, one whistle, one fart, once a year, and he was done. And for this extraordinary annual contribution to the arts, Roland was awarded a manor house and over 100 acres of prime English land in Suffolk. That is a better compensation package than most medieval knights got for actually risking their lives in battle. While other men were out fighting wars and dying of plague, Roland was living on a country estate because he could pass gas on command in front of royalty. Honestly, career goals. 3. The Hanoverian court of 18th century England had a position called the royal cockcrower. And no, this was not some fancy metaphorical title. This was a real human being whose job was to crouch down and crow like a rooster to announce the time. In an era when clocks existed and were perfectly functional, someone decided that what the royal household truly needed was a man making barnyard noises at scheduled intervals. The cockcrower reportedly took his role very seriously, perhaps a little too seriously. According to one famous story, he once aimed his enthusiastic crowing directly at the Prince of Wales, who was not amused at all. The prince had him immediately dismissed from his duties. So this man lost his actual paying job at the royal court because he cock-a-doodle-dooed at the wrong person. That is a sentence that should not exist in any serious historical record, and yet here we are. 4. In the early 1700s, the court of Elector Palatine Charles III Philip in Heidelberg had a court dwarf named Perkeo. His job? Official keeper of the world's largest wine barrel, the Great Heidelberg Tun, which held over 200,000 liters of wine. And Perkeo took his job very personally. The man reportedly drank somewhere between 5 to 8 gallons of wine every single day and never once appeared drunk. When anyone offered him a drink, his answer was always the same. Perché no? Which is Italian for why not? And that is literally how he got his name. He became a local legend, a 3-foot-tall man guarding a 30-foot-tall wine barrel, drinking enough to kill a horse and still showing up to work the next morning. According to legend, Perkeo lived happily for decades on nothing but wine. And then, one fateful day, he made the mistake of drinking a glass of water. He died shortly after. Whether or not that is true, the people of Heidelberg love that story so much they still have a wooden statue of him in the castle. 5. The concept of the whipping boy is one of those historical facts that sounds like a dark comedy sketch, but was absolutely real. In several European royal courts, particularly in England and France, a young boy of noble birth was assigned to be the prince's companion and classmate. But there was a catch. Whenever the prince misbehaved, broke rules, or failed his lessons, the whipping boy was the one who got physically punished, because apparently nobody was allowed to lay a hand on a future king. The entire system relied on the assumption that the prince would feel so guilty watching his friend get beaten for his mistakes that he would behave, which is a wildly optimistic theory of child psychology. In practice, it gave the prince a front-row seat to someone else absorbing the consequences of his actions, which, if you think about it, is basically a masterclass in how to raise a tyrant. Some whipping boys, however, formed such close bonds with their princes that they later became trusted advisors and were granted titles and lands. So, in a twisted way, getting beaten as a child was actually a viable career path in medieval Europe. 6. In the late 18th century, the Russian Empire had an officer named Lieutenant Kije, who was promoted, decorated, married off, and eventually exiled to Siberia. The only problem? He never existed. The whole thing started with a clerical error. A military scribe accidentally created a phantom name in an official document, and when Emperor Paul I saw it, he personally approved the officer's promotion. From that point on, nobody in the entire Russian military had the courage to tell the notoriously paranoid and volatile emperor that he was promoting a person who did not exist. So the bureaucracy just kept going. Lieutenant Kije received commendations. He was reportedly married in an official ceremony that no one attended. He was granted estates. And when Paul eventually grew suspicious or annoyed, Kije was banished to Siberia, where, presumably, he continued not existing in much colder weather. The story became so famous in Russia that composer Sergei Prokofiev wrote an entire orchestral suite about this fictional officer. 7. Grigory Rasputin was a Siberian peasant with no formal education, a wild beard, and an almost supernatural ability to insert himself into the highest levels of Russian power. By the early 1900s, he had become the most trusted advisor to Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra, primarily because he appeared to ease the suffering of their hemophiliac son Alexei through some mysterious method that doctors could not explain. Rasputin used this access to influence political appointments, military decisions, and basically run the Russian court like his personal playground. Nobles despised him, the church wanted him gone, and half of Russia thought he was either a holy man or the devil. When a group of aristocrats finally decided to kill him in 1916, the story became legendary. They reportedly poisoned him with enough cyanide to kill 5 men, shot him multiple times, beat him, and then threw him into an icy river. And even then, the autopsy allegedly showed water in his lungs, meaning he was still alive when he hit the water. Whether every detail is true or slightly exaggerated, the myth of the unkillable mad monk has never faded. 8. In Tudor-era England and across several other European courts, there existed servants known as human bedwarmers. Their job was exactly what it sounds like. Before the king or queen went to sleep, a servant would strip down, climb into the royal bed, and lie there using nothing but their own body heat to warm the sheets. Once the bed was sufficiently toasty, they would quietly slip out and disappear into the night, like some kind of domestic heating ghost. This was considered a legitimate and even respectable position because, in drafty stone castles without central heating, climbing into freezing sheets was apparently a royal problem serious enough to require a dedicated human solution. The servant had to be clean, healthy, and presumably very warm-blooded. There were strict rules about hygiene and behavior, because obviously things could get awkward fast. Just imagine being the person whose entire professional legacy is, "I was warm and I lay in the king's bed before he did." That is your life. That is your contribution to history. And honestly, for a medieval job, you could do a lot worse. 9. Prince Mikhail Golitsyn came from one of Russia's most prestigious noble families. He was educated, well-traveled, and at one point had a perfectly respectable diplomatic career. Then he made one mistake. He married a Catholic Italian woman while abroad, which infuriated Empress Anna of Russia so much that she stripped him of his title and turned him into her personal court jester. But Anna did not stop at just humiliation. She forced Golitsyn to sit in a giant basket in the middle of the court and pretend to hatch eggs like a chicken. For hours. In front of the entire Russian aristocracy. He had to cluck, sit on the eggs, and make chicken noises while nobles watched and laughed. And the finale of his degradation? In 1740, Anna organized a massive spectacle known as the Ice Palace Wedding. She had an entire palace built out of ice on the frozen Neva River, forced Golitsyn to marry another jester in a mock ceremony, and then locked the newlyweds inside the freezing ice palace overnight. This was entertainment for the Russian Empress. A man went from prince to professional chicken impersonator because he married the wrong woman. 10. Triboulet was a court jester who served King Louis XII and later King Francis I of France. He was famous for being genuinely, almost recklessly witty, even by jester standards. One day, Triboulet apparently lost his mind and slapped King Francis I right on the backside, in front of the entire court. The king, as you might expect, did not find this hilarious. He was furious and sentenced Triboulet to death on the spot. But because Francis apparently had a sense of theatrical justice, he gave the jester one final courtesy. Triboulet could choose the manner of his own death. Most people would panic. Triboulet, being the sharpest fool in the room, responded without hesitation. "Good sire, I choose to die of old age." The king burst out laughing. The response was so perfect, so brilliantly clever, that Francis commuted the death sentence and instead banished Triboulet from the kingdom. So this man physically assaulted a king, got sentenced to death, and then talked his way out of it with a single joke. That is not just comedy. That is survival of the wittiest. 11. Locusta was not just any poisoner. She was the official state poisoner of the Roman Empire under Emperor Nero, and she operated with full imperial backing. Her career began under Emperor Claudius's wife Agrippina, who hired Locusta to poison Claudius himself with a dish of mushrooms so that Nero could take the throne. Once Nero was in power, Locusta became his go-to problem solver for any inconvenient relatives. When Nero wanted his stepbrother Britannicus dead, Locusta provided the poison, and when the first dose was too slow, Nero personally beat her and demanded something faster. She delivered. In return for her services, Nero gave Locusta a full pardon for all past crimes, rewarded her with vast estates, and most remarkably, allowed her to open what was essentially a school for poisoners. An actual academy where students learned the craft of mixing lethal substances. She was effectively a government-funded professor of murder with tenure. Locusta's career only ended when Nero fell from power and Emperor Galba had her executed. But for years, she was Rome's deadliest employee with a benefits package. 12. Dr. Theodor Morell was Adolf Hitler's personal physician from 1936 until near the end of World War II, and his medical practices were, to put it mildly, absolutely insane. Morell injected Hitler with a staggering cocktail of substances, sometimes up to 20 injections a day. The list included methamphetamine, oxycodone, bull testosterone extracts, cocaine, and something ominously listed in his notes simply as injection as always. He also administered pills containing strychnine and a concoction made from the intestinal bacteria of a Bulgarian peasant. Other Nazi officers openly despised Morell. They called him the Reich injection master and complained about his terrible body odor and questionable hygiene. Hermann Göring reportedly nicknamed him Herr Reich injection master. But Hitler was utterly dependent on him. By the final years of the war, Hitler's hands trembled. His health was deteriorating rapidly, and historians now believe Morell's treatments significantly worsened every condition they were supposed to fix. The man tasked with keeping the dictator healthy was essentially speedrunning his physical destruction. 13. From 1988 to 2001, the supreme leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-il, employed a Japanese chef known by the alias Kenji Fujimoto as his personal sushi master. This was not a casual gig. Kim Jong-il was obsessed with food quality, and Fujimoto was regularly sent on insane global missions to source ingredients. He traveled to Japan for tuna, to Denmark for pork, to Iran for caviar, and to Uzbekistan for horse meat. He was basically a culinary special agent with a passport full of stamps and a boss who could have him executed for undercooked rice. Life inside the Kim compound was luxurious, but terrifying. Fujimoto described lavish parties, endless liquor, and the constant underlying knowledge that one wrong move meant disappearing forever. In 2001, Fujimoto saw his chance. He told Kim Jong-il that he needed to travel to Japan to buy a specific sea urchin for the leader's dinner. Kim approved the trip. Fujimoto got on the plane, landed in Japan, and simply never went back. He escaped a dictatorship using a sea urchin as his cover story. It might be the greatest excuse to leave work early in human history. 14. King Frederick William I of Prussia had many interests: governing, military reform, fiscal policy. But his true passion, the one thing that consumed him above all else, was tall soldiers. He created an elite regiment known as the Potsdam Giants, or the Lange Curls, composed entirely of men over 6 feet tall, which in the early 1700s was freakishly huge. Frederick William recruited these men from all over Europe, and when recruitment failed, he simply kidnapped them. His agents would drug, trick, or outright abduct tall men from foreign countries and smuggle them to Prussia. He even tried to breed them like livestock, pairing tall soldiers with tall women in hopes of creating even taller offspring. The king spent more money on this one regiment than on almost anything else in his kingdom. He would line them up in his courtyard and just look at them for hours, reportedly finding it soothing. Other European rulers quickly learned that the fastest way to get on Frederick William's good side was to send him a tall man as a diplomatic gift. The irony? The Potsdam Giants never actually saw real combat. They were too expensive and too valuable to the king to risk in battle. 15. The Habsburg dynasty of Austria had many elaborate court traditions, but one of the strangest involved napkin folding. Specifically, the royal napkins at state banquets had to be folded using a technique so precise, so intricate, and so visually stunning that it was classified as an actual state secret. The technique was known as the Habsburg fold, and the knowledge of how to execute it was passed down to only 2 people at any given time. Just 2. In the entire Austrian government. These 2 designated napkin masters would guard this folding technique with the seriousness of a nuclear launch code, and before either one retired or died, they were required to pass the secret on to a successor. This tradition has survived wars, revolutions, the collapse of the empire itself, and reportedly continues in some form in Austrian state events to this day. Somewhere in Austria right now, there are exactly 2 people who know how to fold a napkin in a way that the rest of the world is not allowed to see demonstrated. Entire empires have fallen, but the napkin fold endures. Priorities. 16. John Dee was a mathematician, astronomer, astrologer, and occultist who served as a personal advisor to Queen Elizabeth I of England. He was one of the most brilliant minds of the 16th century, and also one of the most eccentric. Dee claimed to communicate with angels through a series of elaborate rituals involving crystal balls and a medium named Edward Kelly, and he developed an entire angelic language called Enochian that he said the angels dictated to him. Elizabeth consulted Dee on everything from the ideal date for her coronation, which he calculated using astrology, to matters of espionage and foreign policy. Because Dee also worked as a spy for the crown, and when he sent coded messages back to the Queen, he signed them with a specific symbol. 2 circles representing Elizabeth's eyes, meaning, for your eyes only, followed by the number 7. That is right. John Dee signed his secret intelligence reports as 007. Over 300 years before Ian Fleming created James Bond. Whether Fleming was directly inspired by Dee is debated, but the coincidence is almost too perfect. 17. Peter the Great of Russia was known for many things: modernizing Russia, building St. Petersburg, and also founding what might be history's most unhinged advisory council. In 1692, at just 18 years old, Peter created the all-joking, all-drunken Synod of Fools and Jesters. This was an official group of his closest advisors and companions, whose primary function was to get spectacularly, dangerously drunk and mock everything sacred. They held elaborate ceremonies parodying the Russian Orthodox Church, with members given absurd religious titles. Peter appointed a fake pope, fake cardinals, and fake bishops, and their rituals involved massive quantities of alcohol, crude songs, and public indecency that scandalized all of Moscow. This was not some private club that met once a year. The synod operated for over 30 years and held power and influence because its members were Peter's actual inner circle. Serious political decisions were sometimes made between rounds of vodka. The church was horrified, the old nobility was disgusted, and Peter could not have cared less. He was the czar who partied like a frat president with absolute power. 18. The Chevalier d'Eon was one of the most successful spies in 18th century Europe, and also one of history's most fascinating gender-defying figures. Born Charles d'Eon de Beaumont in 1728, d'Eon served King Louis XV of France as a diplomat, soldier, and spy. Early in their career, d'Eon reportedly infiltrated the Russian court of Empress Elizabeth by presenting as a woman, becoming a maid of honor, and gaining access to sensitive intelligence. For the first 49 years of life, d'Eon lived publicly as a man, serving with distinction in the 7 Years' War and negotiating treaties in London. Then, in a dramatic shift, d'Eon claimed to have been assigned female at birth and demanded legal recognition as a woman. King Louis XVI actually agreed, officially ordering d'Eon to dress as a woman from that point forward. d'Eon spent the remaining 33 years of life living as a woman in London. When d'Eon died in 1810, doctors examining the body confirmed that d'Eon was anatomically male, shocking everyone on both sides of the debate. The London Stock Exchange had literally run a betting pool for years on d'Eon's true sex. A spy so good, even their own identity remained classified. 19. In 1514, King Manuel I of Portugal sent a very unusual diplomatic gift to Pope Leo X, a white Indian elephant named Hanno. The Pope was absolutely thrilled. Hanno became Leo's favorite companion, essentially a 4-ton papal pet who lived in the Vatican gardens, had his own dedicated attendants, and was paraded through the streets of Rome during celebrations. The Pope adored this elephant to an almost embarrassing degree. Hanno was given the finest food, decorated with gold and jewels for public appearances, and reportedly could perform tricks like dancing and spraying water on command. When Hanno fell ill in 1516 after only 2 years in Rome, Pope Leo was devastated. He summoned his best doctors to treat the elephant, and in a move that spectacularly backfired, they administered a gold-infused laxative. Hanno died shortly after. The Pope was so heartbroken he commissioned the famous artist Raphael to paint a memorial fresco of Hanno on a Vatican wall. Critics of the papacy, including many who would later support Martin Luther, pointed to the Pope mourning an elephant as proof of how disconnected the church had become from the people. 20. Wei Zhongxian was a eunuch in the Ming Dynasty court who went from being a gambling-addicted servant to the most powerful person in all of China, while the actual emperor was busy building furniture. The Tianqi emperor, who ruled from 1620 to 1627, had zero interest in governing. His real passion was carpentry. He was apparently a genuinely talented woodworker who spent his days making miniature palaces, furniture, and intricate wooden crafts, while Wei Zhongxian quietly took over the entire empire. Wei controlled the secret police, purged his political enemies, censored scholars, and had people tortured and executed by the thousands. And just to make sure everyone knew who was really in charge, he ordered temples built in his own honor across China, where citizens were expected to worship him as if he were a god. Thousands of officials and scholars kowtowed to his portrait. All of this happened while the emperor was in his workshop sanding a table leg. When the Tianqi emperor finally died in 1627, the new emperor immediately moved against Wei, who was ordered to report for punishment. Wei hanged himself before they could get to him. An entire dynasty was nearly destroyed because one emperor loved woodworking more than his own empire. 21. The royal herb strewer was an official position in the English court first documented around 1660, and the job was beautifully simple. This person walked ahead of the king or queen and scattered fragrant herbs and flower petals on the ground. Why? because everything smelled absolutely terrible. In an era before modern plumbing, regular bathing, and effective waste disposal, London and the royal palaces reeked. Open sewers, unwashed bodies, rotting food, and animal waste created a stench so overwhelming that the monarchy needed a dedicated human air freshener walking in front of them at all times. The herb strewer would throw down lavender, rosemary, thyme, and rose petals to create a thin aromatic barrier between the royal nostrils and the horrifying reality of 17th century hygiene. This was not a one-time gig either. The position was held prominently during coronations and state events and was appointed as a salaried role. It was last formally used during the coronation of King George IV in 1821. After that, apparently someone invented better deodorant, or at least convinced the monarchy that the era of professional floor potpourri had finally passed. 22. Incitatus was a racehorse belonging to Roman Emperor Caligula. And if ancient historians are to be believed, this horse lived better than 99% of the Roman population. Incitatus had a stable made of marble, ate from an ivory manger, slept under purple blankets, and was adorned with jeweled collars. The horse had a personal staff of servants, was fed oats mixed with gold flakes, and Caligula would reportedly invite guests to dine in the horse's name at elaborate banquets. According to the Roman historians Suetonius and Cassius Dio, Caligula planned to appoint Incitatus as a consul, one of the highest political offices in Rome. Whether Caligula genuinely intended to make a horse a government official, or whether this was his way of mocking and humiliating the Roman Senate by saying, "A horse could do your job," is still debated by historians. Either interpretation is absolutely devastating. On the day before important races, Caligula would station soldiers around Incitatus's stable to ensure absolute silence so the horse could sleep undisturbed. The entire neighborhood was forced into total quiet for a horse's bedtime. Rome's most unhinged emperor had his priorities. 23. If you were a Roman politician running for office, you needed to remember faces and names, thousands of them, because calling a citizen by name on the street could win you a crucial vote. The problem? Most politicians had the memory of a goldfish when it came to the common people. Enter the nomenclator, a specially trained slave who functioned as a living database. The nomenclator would walk slightly behind or beside his master during public appearances and whisper into his ear the name, family details, recent life events, and political leanings of every single person they encountered. That is Marcus. His wife just had a baby. He is leaning toward supporting Crassus. And the politician would immediately turn and say, "Marcus, congratulations on the new child. How is the family?" As if he had personally been keeping track all along. It was ancient Rome's version of a personal assistant, a facial recognition app, and a Wikipedia search rolled into one human being. Cicero wrote about nomenclators, and their use was so widespread that it became essentially a required accessory for any serious political career. You could not run for consul without your own walking, whispering human cheat sheet. 24. Sir Geoffrey Hudson was born around 1619 and stood just 18 inches tall when he was first presented to Queen Henrietta Maria of England. And the way he was presented? He was served inside a large pie at a royal banquet. The pastry crust was opened, and out popped a tiny, perfectly dressed little man as a living gift to the Queen. Henrietta Maria was delighted and kept Geoffrey as part of her court, where he eventually grew to about 3.5 feet tall. But Geoffrey Hudson was no mere novelty. He was knighted, accompanied the Queen on diplomatic missions, and when a courtier named William Crofts mocked his size one too many times, Geoffrey challenged him to a pistol duel. Crofts showed up with a water squirter as a joke. Geoffrey showed up with an actual loaded pistol and shot him dead. After that, nobody made fun of his height again. But Geoffrey's wild life did not end there. He was later captured by Barbary pirates, sold into slavery in North Africa, and spent 25 years in captivity before finally being ransomed back to England. He popped out of a pie, killed a man in a duel, and survived pirate slavery. Most action heroes would struggle to keep up. 25. When Peter the Great returned from his famous tour of Western Europe in 1698, He came back to Russia with a radical new vision. Russia would modernize, and the first thing to go was beards. In Peter's mind, the long, bushy beards worn by Russian men, especially the old nobility, the boyars, were a symbol of everything backward and un-European about his country. So he declared war on facial hair. Literally. Peter stationed officials at the gates of Moscow armed with razors, and any man entering the city with a beard was stopped and shaved on the spot. No warning, no discussion. Guards would physically hold men down and scrape the beard off their face while they screamed. For the deeply religious, whose Orthodox faith considered shaving a sin, this was not just humiliating but spiritually devastating. Eventually, Peter realized he could make money off this obsession and introduced a beard tax. Men who wanted to keep their facial hair had to pay an annual fee and carry a special copper token that read "tax paid" as proof. If you could not produce the token, the beard came off. This war on beards lasted decades and was not officially repealed until 1772, nearly 50 years after Peter's death. 26. The Roman Emperor Tiberius was deeply obsessed with astrology, but he had a terrifying way of testing his astrologers. He would invite them to his cliffside villa on the island of Capri, consult them about his future, and if he suspected they were lying or incompetent, he would have them thrown off the cliff into the sea. One by one, astrologers came, made predictions, and were tossed over the edge. Enter Thrasyllus of Mendes, an astrologer from Egypt who arrived at Capri knowing full well what had happened to his predecessors. Tiberius was impressed by Thrasyllus's readings and asked him to cast one final horoscope, his own. Tiberius wanted to know, did Thrasyllus see anything in his own immediate future? Thrasyllus studied the stars, then turned pale and said, "I see that I am in great danger at this very moment." It was the perfect answer. It proved to Tiberius that Thrasyllus was genuinely reading the stars because he was, in fact, standing on the edge of a cliff about to be murdered. Tiberius was so impressed he spared him, and Thrasyllus became his trusted personal astrologer for the rest of his life. The man literally saved himself by predicting his own near-death experience in real time. 27. In April 1817, a mysterious young woman appeared in the English village of Almondsbury near Bristol. She spoke no English, wore exotic clothing, and gestured wildly at everything as if she had never seen European civilization before. Local aristocrats, fascinated by this apparent foreigner, took her in. A Portuguese sailor conveniently appeared who claimed to understand her language and translated her incredible story. She was Princess Caraboo, a royal from the island of Javasu in the Indian Ocean, who had been kidnapped by pirates and somehow ended up in England. British high society was captivated. Princess Caraboo was invited to manor houses, studied by academics, and treated like visiting royalty for weeks. She performed exotic dances, wrote in a mysterious script, prayed to her own god, and swam naked in a lake because that was apparently what princesses from Javasu did. Then a boarding house owner from Bristol saw her picture in the newspaper and immediately recognized her as Mary Baker, a former servant girl from Devon, who'd been making up languages and exotic personas for years. The entire thing was an elaborate con. Mary had fooled professors, linguists, and the cream of British society with nothing but confidence and a made-up language. She was eventually shipped off to America, where, naturally, she tried the same trick again. 28. If you were a wealthy aristocrat in 17th or 18th century England, your carriage did not just need horses, it needed running footmen. These were athletic servants, usually young men, whose job was to literally run ahead of the horse-drawn carriage at full speed to clear the road, scout for obstacles, pay tolls in advance, and announce their master's arrival. They ran for miles, sometimes at speeds rivaling the carriage itself, wearing light livery and carrying a tall staff with a hollow silver ball on top that was filled with a mixture of wine and egg whites, which they would drink on the run for energy. It was the 18th century's version of an energy drink. Being a running footman was considered a prestigious athletic position, and some aristocrats would race their footmen against each other for sport and gambling. But the job was also brutally dangerous. Running at top speed for hours in all weather conditions was devastating to the body, and accounts from the period mention footmen simply collapsing and dying mid-run from heart failure or exhaustion. When road conditions improved and carriages got faster, the running footman could no longer keep up, and the profession gradually disappeared. All that remains is a pub in London called I Am the Only Running Footman. 29. The Comte de Saint-Germain was one of the most mysterious figures to ever walk through the courts of 18th century Europe, and his claims were absolutely wild. He appeared at the court of King Louis XV of France sometime in the 1740s, a charming, multilingual, incredibly well-dressed man who claimed to be several hundred years old. He told anyone who would listen that he had personally dined with Queen Cleopatra, had a friendly chat with Jesus Christ at the wedding at Cana, and had discovered the secret of eternal life through alchemy. And the strangest part? People believed him, or at least they could not prove him wrong. He spoke at least 6 languages fluently, played violin like a master, painted beautifully, and appeared to never age during the decades people knew him. Voltaire reportedly called him the man who knows everything and never dies. Louis XV was fascinated and gave Saint-Germain apartments at the royal palace and used him as a diplomatic envoy. After his supposed death in 1784, reports of sightings continued for years. Some claim to have met him in the 1800s, still looking exactly the same. He was either history's greatest con artist, or he is still out there somewhere, presumably looking fabulous. 30. The court of King Louis XIV at the Palace of Versailles employed an absolutely staggering number of servants for incredibly specific tasks. Among the most absurdly niche was the official responsible for dealing with vermin and insects within the royal chambers. Versailles, for all its legendary beauty, had a serious pest problem. The palace was enormous, poorly ventilated in many areas, and constantly full of food, people, and waste, making it an absolute paradise for cockroaches, fleas, and other unwanted guests. Having a dedicated servant whose job was to wage daily war against the insect population of the king's bedroom was not a joke, it was a necessity. And this was just one of thousands of hyper-specific roles at Versailles. There were servants responsible for the royal nightcap, the royal gloves, the right sleeve, the left sleeve, each with their own salary and rank in the household hierarchy. Louis XIV's court employed around 10,000 people, many with duties so narrowly defined that their entire working day might consist of handing the king a single article of clothing at a specific moment. Versailles was not just a palace. It was a bureaucratic universe where even the cockroaches had a dedicated nemesis. 31. Narcissus was a eunuch in the court of Byzantine, Emperor Justinian I, and by every expectation of his era, he should have spent his life as a palace servant managing the imperial household. Instead, he became one of the most brilliant military commanders in Roman history. After the legendary general Belisarius struggled to finish the reconquest of Italy from the Ostrogoths, Justinian turned to Narcissus, who was already over 70 years old at the time. Narcissus marched into Italy and delivered a series of devastating victories, culminating in the total defeat of the Gothic kingdom and the restoration of imperial control over the Italian peninsula. He was strategic, disciplined, and ruthlessly effective. His soldiers loved him because he treated them fairly and paid them well. Justinian trusted him precisely because, as a eunuch, Narcissus could never claim the throne for himself. Narcissus governed Italy for over a decade as its effective ruler. When the next emperor's wife, Empress Sophia, tried to insult him by sending him a golden spindle and suggesting he go back to spinning with the palace women, Narcissus reportedly replied that he would spin her a thread she could never unravel. He was talking about inviting the Lombards into Italy, which some historians believe he actually did. A eunuch servant who conquered a continent and threatened an empress. Not bad for someone who was supposed to manage the curtains. 32. The keeper of the king's swans, now known as the Royal Swan Marker, is a real official position in the United Kingdom that has existed for centuries and still exists today. It stems from a medieval law declaring that all unmarked mute swans in open waters in England and Wales belong to the crown. Every year, during a tradition called swan upping, The Royal Swan Marker leads a fleet of traditional rowing boats called skiffs up the Thames River to count, catch, weigh, measure, and health check every single swan. The teams wear special uniforms, the boats fly royal flags, and when a swan is spotted, the cry goes all up, and the boats close in. It sounds like a military operation, and in a way, it is. This tradition dates back to the 12th century, when swans were considered a delicacy for royal banquets, and knowing exactly how many you had was a matter of genuine importance. Today, nobody is eating the swans. The swan upping is purely about conservation, monitoring the health of the swan population, and keeping alive one of the most beautifully absurd traditions in the British monarchy. The current royal swan marker, David Barber, has been doing this since 1993. His official job is to count swans for the king, and he takes it extremely seriously. 33. The position of royal food taster, or pregustator, as the Romans called it, holds the distinction of being perhaps the most consistently dangerous job in the entire history of employment. The concept is simple. Before a ruler eats anything, someone else eats it first, and everyone waits to see if that person drops dead. If the taster survives, the meal is safe. If not, well, the taster served their purpose. In ancient Rome, Emperor Claudius famously had a food taster named Helotus, which did not save Claudius at all because Helotus was allegedly in on the poisoning plot that killed him. During World War II, Joseph Stalin had a personal food taster whose job was essentially to be a human lab rat for every meal. Hitler had a team of 15 young women who were forced to taste his vegetarian meals before he ate them. And this is not just ancient history. Reports suggest that food tasting continues in modified form for modern heads of state. The psychology of it is remarkable. Every single meal, you sit there watching another human being eat your food, and you wait. Both of you know exactly what is happening. It is the most awkward lunch imaginable, repeated 3 times a day, every day. For the rest of your career or your life, whichever ends first. Every powerful ruler in history had someone behind them doing something absolutely ridiculous to keep the machine running. And honestly, these people were the real backbone of civilization. Now, I need you to settle something in the comments. Rank these 3 jobs from best to worst. The guy who wiped the king's butt, the guy who farted once a year for a mansion, or the person who warmed the king's bed naked and then disappeared. There is a correct answer, and I know you have opinions. Drop them below. If you made it this far, you already belong here, so subscribe and hit that like button.